Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the 19th annual Noel Hynes lecture series. My name is Michelle Gray. I'm going to do some introductions in a second and set the stage for the talk today. But first, I wouldn't mind getting some feedback to make sure that everyone can see my screen okay and can hear me okay. You can use the chat box to let me know. Or the question box. Yep. Okay. So thanks, Bob. All right. I'm going to cue the slide back up. Okay. As I said, so good morning and thank you all for attending. We had some great registrations. So I'm hoping we're going to probably have some few more people petering in the next few minutes. But I want to thank you all for attending today's lecture. My name is Michelle Gray. I'm a faculty member here at the University of New Brunswick. In the Faculty of Forestry and Environmental Management, but I'm also the director of the Canadian Rivers Institute. It's my pleasure today to be able to introduce the 2020 Hynes Lecture, obviously in a much different format than we're used to. It's nice to be able to see people's face and bring in these leading researchers into Canada and to visit with our researchers and students, but of course we're doing it in a slightly different way this year. I want to tell you a little bit about what the Canadian Rivers Institute is, and then what the Hynes Lecture is all about, what the Hynes Lecture series is all about. So the Canadian Rivers Institute itself is a group of researchers who love rivers and seek to make every river a healthy river. And we also like to collaborate together on both research and teaching. This year I began at the University of New Brunswick with 4 founding members back in 2001, and now we've grown to over 30 fellows and hundreds of research associates, graduate students, postdocs throughout Canada and also internationally. One of the things that this CRI does each year and does well is the Hynes Lecture Series, where we invite an international leader of some area of river science to come and talk to us about their research. This began in 2002 when UNB conferred an honorary doctoral degree on for Dr. Noel Hynes. And since then, we've had 18 previous outstanding speakers from many countries. Many of you will probably know who Noel Hynes is, but for those who don't, he's acknowledged as the founder of modern stream ecology. He was the founding director of the Department of Biology at the University of Waterloo in 1964. And together with his students, he undertook studies of many varied processes and fundamental issues with stream ecology. He would not call himself an entomologist, but he contributed greatly to the study of benthic invertebrates while exploring various stream processes. So The Ecology of Running Waters was published in 1971, is still highly used today and was reprinted. He wrote over 190 papers and supervised over 30 graduate students and postdocs. He was awarded almost every national, international accolade available to an aquatic ecologist. He retired in 1984, but continued active research until, and he remained active as a distinguished professor emeritus, and then published 1 year before his passing in 2009 at 91 years old, so he did quite well. Before I introduce the speaker, I would just like to say that we want to I want you to stay tuned for later. We've got the Hynes Scholarship that will be announced later today, and also the Bud and Peggy Bird Scholarship, and we will be announcing those across all of our platforms, across social media, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter, but we'll also be releasing the Hynes public lecture. There's always a scientific and then a public lecture video, and we'll be releasing that later this afternoon. And I'm just going to have to struggle here for a second because I don't have all of my notes in front of me. Just hang on. I don't know if I can pause out just a second. Here we go. Okay, so as I just wanted to introduce briefly, but it's always hard when we have a Hynes lecture speaker come in. There's no such thing as a brief introduction because, as I said, we bring in leaders, international leaders within this river science, and so they generally have quite an accomplishment behind them. So today we're happy to be able to invite Dr. Angela Arthington, who's a professor emeritus from the Australian Rivers Institute. And she's joining us from Australia today, where it's much later for her. It's a 13-hour time change. So just as for her introduction, she established the first Queensland Freshwater Research Institute at Griffith University in 1987. Her research team worked on river fish communities and flow regimes in Queensland's coastal rivers. She produced the award-winning text, The Freshwater Fishes of Northeastern Australia. And environmental flows research started with the assessment of water flows to support river fish communities, and progressed towards frameworks that address the needs of the entire riverine biota and ecosystems. In 2012, she published The Environmental Flows Saving Rivers in the Third Millennium, and was thrilled to receive the Making a Difference Award from the U.S. In-Stream Flow Council during the 2015 Flows Conference in Portland, USA. In 2018, she led a global team to produce the Brisbane Declaration and Global Action Agenda on Environmental Flows in 2018, and which was an updated blueprint and way forward to protect and restore water regimes and freshwater ecosystems. And their links to groundwater and estuarine systems dependent on freshwater flows. Recent activities include government advisory roles to promote the conservation of floodplain rivers in Australia's Lake Eyre Basin, production of a special issue on springs of the Great Artesian Basin, and editing for international journals. A recent blog calls for more action on environmental flows and to halt the decline in freshwater biodiversity and bring waters back to our planet. So it's a thrill for a bunch of us that are actually working on environmental flows. And so without further ado, what I'll do is move on to her lecture. So what we'll do afterwards, sorry, I'll just mention quickly, we will have a question and answer period afterwards where for online attendees, you'll be able to raise your virtual hand and we can call on you. You can raise your virtual hand and you can unmute, or we will unmute you and you can ask your question, or you can type your questions in the question box. So I will take my webcam off and start the lecture.
Good morning, colleagues and friends. I extend my own welcome to you to my lecture in honour of HBN Hynes. I am delighted by the invitation from the Canadian Rivers Institute. I appreciate the privilege and I congratulate the Institute on its leadership role in river science and management. My theme today, as you know, is progress with environmental flows to maintain healthy rivers and healthy societies. Here I'm providing a few statistics just to put us in the mood. Of how drastically humans have changed the global water cycle by building reservoirs, dam walls, weirs, removing water, and so forth. Here are some statistics from Lerna, 2011, 16.7 million impoundments, larger than 100 metres squared worldwide, 16.7 million, probably many more since that was published. Gleek gives us some information about the volume of water restored, 8,000 kilometres cubed, 1/6 of the total annual flow of river water into the oceans, and estimated that only 23% of rivers flow interrupted to the ocean, and many of them are in remote areas. Most of the developed areas, rivers do not reach the ocean at the times and as frequently as they should. A traditional and now well-established approach to address changes to river flows and the ecological consequences are termed environmental flows. I'm sure this term is very familiar to this audience, but I'd like to define it in terms of a recent publication, which I will come back to much later in this lecture. Here it is. Environmental flows describe the quantity, timing, and quality of freshwater flows and levels necessary to sustain aquatic ecosystems, which in turn support human cultures, economies, sustainable livelihoods, and well-being. The evolution of environmental flows has a long history, but to guide us today, I'm going to follow this amazing diagram provided by Leroy Poff and John Matthews in a publication in 2013. I think it's a marvellous summary. These authors have divided the history of environmental flows from the late 1980s into 4 eras, which you can see on the left-hand side of the diagram, and which I will follow through this lecture. Down the left-hand side of the coloured blocks in green, we see the participants in the processes of environmental flows, and on the right, the evolving dimensions of environmental flows. But down the middle is the pathway I'm going to follow, which begins with natural flow regime paradigm and moves right through to future water, global environmental flows acceptance, and the adoption of environmental flows into various high-level international policies. To start us off, I'm going to look back over the history of early methods. This is where I came into the picture. I began to look at environmental flows in the early 80s, and I found information on the methods available, largely in terms of 3 types of method: hydrological rules, such as percentage of historical flow, Tennant method; simple hydraulic analysis, which produced information on wetted perimeter or depths and velocities used by species, usually fish; and then a more sophisticated form of habitat modelling, exemplified by PHABSIM, physical habitat simulation package, in the in-stream flow incremental methodology. In my picture here, I'm showing you some of my colleagues starting out on our research to understand the water depth, flow, velocity, habitat requirements of fish in rivers of eastern Queensland. My colleagues undertook electrofishing and block seine netting and sweep netting through riffles, runs and pools to document details of the habitat requirements of all the fish captured in different rivers along the coast from south to north. This information is now being published in a book, which is a kind of Bible in Australia for the ecology of fish in northeastern Australia, for which we won an award. I'll move on from that because I talk about it in my public lecture. The methods that I've just outlined briefly here were produced by a remarkable team of people. Bob Milhouse was a major player early on in the development of PHABSIM. Ian Jart from New Zealand came into the picture and developed another river hydraulic habitat simulation package, RIHABSIM, and made it available throughout New Zealand and to ourselves in Australia. And more recently, Tom Payne has come in with another river habitat simulation package. And together, these 3 authors and a Spanish colleague have produced CIFA, System for Environmental Flow Analysis. And I've listed there what it can do. It provides information on habitat over cross sections, suitability criteria for fish, water temperature and dissolved oxygen modelling, sediment analysis, riparian inundation modelling, and a time series analysis of flows in aquatic habitat. I believe it's widely used and freely available. But against this background of packages that have been used routinely in assessments and sometimes in conflicting situations to resolve environmental flow issues, I'd like to mention that there are many other splendid areas of research into more detailed methods for particular applications. And here I'm showing one sent to me courtesy of Alan Curry. Thank you very much, Alan. Providing the model that is being used in their studies on the St John River to determine whether or not particular dams can be removed and how to assess the likely implications of removal. But in that package, there is a very fine collection of methods that have been tried over many years by many colleagues, and I've just listed their elements in the right-hand side. But they seem to be doing exactly what is appearing in previous models, but with more research information associated with the estimation of habitat requirements. And I applaud what I'm seeing here in this study. I'd like to mention now how I got involved in environmental flows in elements of the flow regime beyond the needs of biota for water and habitat. In the early 1990s, I met up with a group of people working in South Africa on environmental flows, and in particular, Dr. Jackie King, who led a group at the University of Cape Town. She was struggling with the application of PHABSIM in South African rivers, and I had been trying RIHABSIM with the help of Ian Jart from New Zealand in southeast Queensland rivers. We met up in South Africa and then later in Australia during a workshop. And together with another group of people, a wider group of South African and Australian colleagues, we came to the position that habitat assessment was essential, but there were many layers of information that we needed to understand in addition to habitat requirements. And so we came up with this idea of a holistic approach to environmental flow assessment. And we stated that environmental flows were for the riverine ecosystem from source to terminal water body. And we stated that it was necessary to identify and mimic elements of the natural flow regime required to maintain biota and ecological processes. And there's the reference. It was a conference proceedings paper, but nevertheless very widely cited. Coincidentally, at the same time, Hill and colleagues produced a very similar concept, published in 1991 in Rivers, and you can see here that they are layering up levels of water flow according to a seasonal pattern in order to provide for the needs of fish, the channel, riparian zone, and the floodplain. For myself and colleagues working on environmental flows in Australia and in South Africa, the publication of the Natural Flow Regime Paradigm in 1997 was another landmark event. Holistic environmental flow assessments have been greatly spurred on by the insights of the paradigm. It gave us new perspectives on vital elements of the river flow regimes, and out of it came the mantra: flow magnitude, flow timing, flow frequency, rate of change, and predictability. A very familiar mantra now in the language of environmental flows. This paper helped us to understand ecological effects of hydrological alterations. It informed us about reference targets for restoration of rivers using environmental flows, and it served as a model for river conservation, framed around the river's natural flow regime. From 1997 onward, there were many publications documenting the importance of flow in relation to the characteristics of rivers, their biodiversity, their ecological processes, and so forth. One of these was a paper published by myself and Stuart Bunn on aquatic biodiversity and natural flow regimes, published in 2002. And here's the image that Stuart prepared so brilliantly to document 4 principles that we developed together. The first principle relates, not surprisingly, to the relationship between flow elements, channel form, habitat complexity, catch disturbance, and their consequences for biological diversity. The second principle adds a layer about the life cycle requirements of species living in rivers and their dependence on certain characteristics of the flow regime as stimuli or factors involved in successful spawning and recruitment. The third principle relates to connectivity, a familiar term now, not so familiar back then. Lateral connectivity, the flow of water onto floodplains and its role in life cycle processes and productivity of rivers. And longitudinal connectivity, the capacity for biota, particularly fish, to migrate up and down rivers when they were flowing with sufficient volume to bypass impediments along the channel. And we added to the 3 principles another one which seemed to be very logical at the time from our knowledge of the fact that many alien species have invaded rivers and that their success may or may not depend on their compatibility with the flow regime. Our principle is that natural flow regime tends to discourage invasive species, a pattern which is appearing around the world in many rivers. The emergence of the concept of holistic environmental flow assessment methods and the growth in understanding of the importance of flow to rivers' ecosystems and their species and processes led to a proliferation of regime-based environmental flow frameworks. The very first of these was the building block methodology, which grew straight out of the holistic approach. Jackie King took the ideas back to South Africa and with her colleagues developed the concept of building a flow regime from the bottom up, which might be low or even no flows, adding freshers, high channel flows, and floods of various dimensions, and at various times of the year to mimic critical elements of the natural flow regime. This diagram on the left depicts how this methodology worked. We call it a bottom-up method, and it is still used today throughout South Africa as their standard methodology, and in many other parts of the world. In other countries, for instance in Australia, environmental flow methods based on holistic concepts also mushroomed and several were produced. In fact, at one stage there were slightly different methods for every state and territory while we were busily engaged in the concept of implementing environmental flows. I was involved in developing two of them. I called them the flow restoration method, and my colleagues and I worked on one in Queensland called the benchmarking method, which has some similarities to drift, which I will come to presently. Similar techniques and methods evolved in the UK and in the USA, and eventually a most recent development was the framework called Aloha, which I will also come back to presently. During this very active phase of the development of environmental flow assessment frameworks, I was invited again to South Africa to join a team led by Dr. Jackie King to develop a methodology to predict the effects of scenarios of change in flow regime on the biophysical and sociological features of montane rivers in Lesotho. These beautiful rivers flow through deep gullies and onto floodplains and are very important in supporting the livelihoods of Lesotho peoples, especially in terms of their use of fish as a major dietary component, their dependence on good water quality, the use of the river for various social activities, recreation, and so forth. And this was the first time in my experience that the biophysical and the sociological elements had been brought together. As we developed this method, Jackie asked all of the participants to come up with a name for it, and I suggested CRITA, critical thresholds of ecological response, because that was essentially what we were being asked to predict from a relatively limited amount of information. I was in charge of the fish methodology, and I was joined in this work by Mark Kennard from Griffith University and a new PhD graduate who had worked on fish in these Lesotho rivers, Johannes Rau. Together we came up with the framework depicted here, and essentially it was a hydraulic method overlaid by ecological information. We had information on the hydraulic characteristics of the rivers at certain cross sections, such as maximum depth, wetted perimeter, mean velocity, substrate characteristics, and aquatic vegetation patterns. And over that we laid information about the life cycle requirements of the fish in the rivers, drawn from studies by Johan and a few others, and also drawn from the broader literature on those species in other parts of South Africa. And over that, we were able to lay ecological principles such as those derived from the Arthington paper. You'll note in this diagram in the left that we were required to predict not only the consequences of flow regime change, but to express our confidence in our predictions and the consequences for social element. Since those early developmental stages on the Lesotho Highlands Water Project, the framework drift has developed and diversified remarkably. It now enables a water manager to be informed about the implications of a range of scenarios of interest to the circumstances, about the consequences for social and ecological elements of a river system in relation to changes in flow regime. It takes those assessments right to the level of macroeconomics for each scenario. For this remarkable range of work, Dr. Jackie King has been awarded the Stockholm Water Prize for 2019, and there she is receiving it at the Stockholm Water Prize ceremony. It's such a worthy award, and I am very pleased that I was involved in the early stages of the development of drift. My work on environmental flow assessments for Australian rivers and the work that I did with Jackie in the Lesotho Highlands Water Project made me aware of the importance of understanding the particular characteristics of a flow regime and their particular consequences for the river ecosystem. In Australia, working on a method called the benchmarking methodology, a group of scientists was asked to advise on the likely changes in the ecosystems as a result of flow alterations. And having done that for some rivers in southeast Queensland, we were then asked to provide the same sorts of predictions in rivers further to the north, where the flow regimes were not identical. We were actually asked to transfer the southern to the mid Queensland coastal rivers. And as a group, we said No, we don't think this should be done. We think that those relationships are peculiar to the individual river flow regime, and that we should be looking for analogues in the region and not from further south or further north. So this got me thinking about the importance of understanding differences between river flow regimes and their ecological consequences, and also the relationships between flow regime change and ecological response. As often happens in the wonderful world of science, another opportunity arose to explore these ideas with a different group of colleagues. Together with Stuart Bunn, Roy Hoff and Robert Nyman, I was able to write a paper expressing the ideas about the differences in flow regime characteristics and the implications of flow regime change in rivers of different hydrological class. The idea of classifying the rivers hydrologically came from Leroy, who had been thinking and working along these lines for many years. And we produced a paper, The Challenge of Providing Environmental Flow Rules to Sustain River Ecosystems. The first version of it was not met with great favour from the reviewers. It was a fairly simplistic expression of the ideas, and it was sent back for revision. And we worked together to clarify our thinking and to give strength to the idea of classifying rivers into different categories and understanding ecological responses across gradients of flow alteration. We also raised the idea that these relationships might be direct linear, curvilinear, or threshold, or something else altogether. Well, this version of the paper went back to the editor, and she wrote to me and said, "The difference between your first version and this version is like night and day. I'm accepting it without any changes, and it will be published in the next issue of the journal." This was a thrill and a big achievement at that time. Well, this thinking eventually brought together another team of scientists from South Africa, Australia, the United States, and other parts of the world to develop a new methodology which we called LOHA. Originally, it was called LOHA, Limits of Hydrological Alteration, but then we decided that it ought to have ecological in it. It's not a fancy Hawaiian greeting. It's actually now a technical term for a framework for developing regional environmental flow standards. There's the diagram, I believe, drawn up by Julian Alden, taking us through a scientific process and a social process, 4 steps in the scientific process, and a related and parallel social process where people at risk or influenced by changes in flow make an input as to their needs, the flow relationships that would protect their needs, and the acceptability of various scenarios of flow regime alteration or flow regime recovery. And the model has built in a monitoring phase and a capacity for adaptive adjustments. On the right, we see Roy and Brian Richter, 2 of the major players in the publication that came from this. LOHA aims to identify flow alteration and ecological response relationships in rivers of contrasting hydrological character. And here are the steps as set out in the model. The first stage is to assemble a hydrological foundation of natural and altered flow data for the rivers of the studied region. And from that information, to classify the rivers based on their natural flow patterns, as indicated in this diagram. The third step has 2 phases, and the first of those is to develop an ecological foundation of flow ecology relationships. The idea here is to assemble what is known about the ecology of the river in relation to its natural flow regime. Some of this information can be gleaned from the literature and some from the fieldwork when one is attempting to study rivers across gradients of flow alteration from natural to highly altered. The ecological foundation also gives guidance on the characteristics that should be better understood in terms of components of the flow and the biological response characteristics of the river system. The second phase of this part of the project is to set up the gradients of flow alteration and to measure or obtain data on ecological responses to particular changes in flow across gradients from low to severe alteration, and from that to seek relationships or thresholds that are unacceptable or deemed to be unsustainable level of flow regime change. And in this diagram from the challenge paper, we're simply illustrating two different shapes of a response curve. I'm now going to give a quick overview of uptake of the Aloha framework from my reading of the literature and my knowledge of the work of several colleagues around the world. I found in looking at the citations available that development of the hydrologic foundation was perhaps the most productive area arising from this methodology. I found new information on the choice of metrics and methods of regime analysis, and I found great interest in building or modelling the natural baseline at unregulated sites, which is an important part of the Aloha framework if there are limited gauging stations providing field data. There was significant work on hydrological classifications at country, province and river basin scales. And I also found papers that carry out a subsequent geomorphological classification nested within the hydrological classification, which was an element of the methodology particularly stressed by Leroy. I found methods on physical habitat modelling and habitat typologies, and also work on river floodplain connectivity modelling. Then in turn, there was a significant literature on assessment of hydrological alterations and the mapping of alteration patterns across catchments. And altogether, the systems studied were quite broad. They came from undeveloped regions, hydropower systems, rivers and agricultural catchments, and urban streams. One of the first papers to present a hydrogeological classification came from Reddy Lehrman and Julian Alden and their colleagues working on the Skagit River system in Washington state. And here we can see that they produced 11 hydrogeomorphic classes in that major catchment. Their definition of the geomorphic differences was related to whether or not the rivers were dominantly able or unable to migrate onto a floodplain. This was deemed an appropriate level of geomorphic differentiation for the rivers of this basin. In the bottom left, you can see that some of them were rainfall dominated, but many had an influence of snow, which seems to me to be an extraordinary environment to be working in, living in subtropical Queensland in Australia. Here is an example of a very different approach to using the Aloha framework. It comes from a major research project conducted in the northern parts of Australia by multidisciplinary, multi-agency, multi-state experts in river science and management. TRAC, Tropical Rivers and Coastal Knowledge. In this program, a classification of rivers was developed by Mark Kennard, and the three categories of river hydrology are shown in the diagram. And in association with each of those types of rivers, significant ecological information has been gathered. In addition, information about the uses of the river and its biota by Aboriginal peoples has also been accumulated. Brad Pusey, my splendid colleague in the right-hand corner of this photograph, developed a framework which he called the Aloha Process Navigator, a web-based framework within which information from each of those elements of the track study was placed in a virtual box on the website, and each box can be opened and the data and information available about that step of Aloha is there for the reading in the form of papers or databases or diagrams and other sources of data. In addition to that, Brad developed an eFlows treatise in which he explained the methodology, explained the background ecological understanding, and produced conceptual, empirical, and Bayesian models of flow ecology relationships. He also developed 42 principles to guide water management and environmental flows in these northern rivers. He called this NEWT, such a nice name, Northern Environmental Water Tools. Applications of the Aloha framework emerged very quickly also from the TNC under the guidance of Eloise Kendi, who produced a practical guide to environmental flows for policy and planning. In that guide, she summarises early applications of the approach, which drew upon a range of information collected for rivers, in particular river basins. And in the right box, I've summarised the sources of data. For example, invertebrate data from river health monitoring, Habitat suitability for fish was one of the aspects that were considered. Fish data on species, guilds and community structure, and information on riparian vegetation, such as cover and species richness. On the left, we can see a curve relationship used to determine a level of acceptable removal of water from the flow regime and the ecological consequences for two groups of species. Aloha has been applied at the time of this study in 6 states, 3 interstate river basins, and in a USA-Mexico environmental flow study. And undoubtedly there are more studies coming out using Aloha in one way or another. I received funding from the National Water Commission in Australia to carry out a trial of Aloha in southeast Queensland. In this region, we had been through a 10-year drought, and there was discussion about impounding more of the headwater streams to provide greater security of water for urban, rural and irrigation purposes. It seemed a good opportunity to provide advice on the effects of flow regime change on these river systems. So I assembled a team and we began to carry out an Aloha study step by step. We focused our study on the effects of flow regime alteration on riparian vegetation, aquatic vegetation and fish. To my knowledge, very few studies have examined this particular combination of ecological response variables in an Aloha study. In this diagram, I've summarised the main characteristics of the flow regime in terms of interannual variability and predictability, seasonal pattern and flood magnitude. And in the little boxes, I've indicated some of the relationships that we found. I'm going to move on from this and talk more about the results for the fish component of the study, which is my area of expertise. But we did find some very interesting and relevant relationships for both plants and riparian vegetation. Several papers have been written on the ecological responses of fish to flow regime change in this region. And in those papers, we have recorded responses of fish to changes in flow that echo those found in other parts of the world, in other studies. In particular, that changes in fish reproductive guilds can occur when naturally variable sites shift towards reduced flow variability and increased flow stability. Under those conditions, we, like others, have observed that opportunistic fish species were replaced by equilibrium species, or at least became less abundant than in unregulated sites. We also noted fish fluvial specialists were replaced by generalists, and an increase in the abundance of certain alien species, particularly Gambusia, the mosquito fish. It was encouraging to find ecological responses that echoed findings in the wider literature. Moving south from southeast Queensland into the Murray-Darling Basin, here I'm presenting some results from a study conducted by a consortium of university scientists and scientists from CSIRO, a study called Ecological Responses to Altered Flow Regimes, a flagship research cluster. Reports are available for the study online. Here I'm presenting the classification and mapping of ecological assets. This program developed a classification that went beyond riverine classes. They did describe 14 riverine classes across the Murray-Darling Basin, from lowland rivers to small headwater streams, but they also recorded the distribution of floodplain, wetland and lake classes across the basin. And from that information, they were able to identify flow management opportunities and strategies for the Murray-Darling Basin. In this figure here, the map on the right shows the big green blobs, which are storage areas, their size indicating their storage volume and capacity. And the distribution of the reddish coloured lines indicate. I'd like to move now to what an Aloha study can offer in terms of tools for management. This is my summary of the benefits which I see coming from Aloha studies. First of all, it enables mapping of river condition at multiple spatial scales, across regions, across basins, within tributaries, across a whole jurisdiction if the data are available. And I think that kind of broad distribution of information on condition is fundamental to deciding how to restore and how to conserve rivers. It enables us to understand and model flow alteration impacts on river ecosystems, and they can be modelled in many different dimensions. The paper Eloha lists all the characteristics, all the biological indicators that could be measured to assist in Eloha study, and they could include population modelling. It enables managers to set limits to flow alteration and to deliver environmental flows for rivers of distinctive flow regime type. One can minimise ecological impacts in the most sensitive high-value water bodies. It enables a manager to prioritise river segments for flow regime restoration at basin and regional scales. And it does enable the development of models to predict how rivers may change under different flow regime scenarios. For example, scenarios of human water use, scenarios associated with new infrastructure, river management strategies, and climate change scenarios. At this point in my lecture, I'm proud to say that I have published a book on environmental flows, published by the University of California Press, and I also have a chapter in the book depicted on the right, Water for the Environment, edited by Avril Horn and several colleagues, and published in 2017. My chapter in that book was written with Leroy Poff and Rebecca Tharm, and it takes the reader through the evolution of environmental flow approaches and makes some recommendations about developments needed in the future. I commend these books to you and hope that you'll poke your nose into mine at least. Looking back over the history of environmental flows over the last 40 years, I see immense progress with environmental flow assessment methods and the underlying science. But we must be aware that new challenges face us as we move into an era of changing climates, changing flow regimes, altered thermal and water quality regimes, and devastating impacts on freshwater ecosystems. Here I've pulled out a few recent publications to document what is being said in the literature about coping with climate change. Pound, for example, demonstrates the 336 freshwater taxa devastating climate change impacts, major restructuring of diatom-sensitive insect and fish communities, decreasing range of functionally important taxa, and the expansion of warm water taxa. He sums up by saying that we're going to see increasing biotic homogenization, loss of diversity, in other words. In a paper by Ackerman and co., in which I was involved, we talked about how to decide on what the objectives of environmental flow studies should be. We will have to consider what should be protected, what should be restored, or how to adapt to the fact that we're going to have shifting ecosystems, moving from present day to hybrid to novel kinds of ecosystems that we haven't seen before. And we must make decisions about how to manage water in relation to those scenarios. In the paper by Leroy Poff, he talks about moving beyond the natural flow regime and warns us that we cannot depend on the concept of trying to mimic a natural flow regime in many instances of river restoration around the world. We will not be able to go backwards to the original state because rivers are shifting in their baseline characteristics and other environmental regimes are also changing. His advice is to manage for ecological resilience and that we need environmental flows that will sustain robust, persistent and socially valued ecological characteristics in a flexible and adaptive management framework. And on the right of this slide, I'm just showing an image by a very recent paper in Nature by Tonkin, Poff and others, which is advising that we must prepare for river ecosystems in an uncertain future. And their major method is that we need a capacity to predict ecological states under shifting geomorphic, hydrological, water quality and thermal regimes. We must develop predictive models, and their advice is to work at the population level and work through life history models so that we can use life history models to predict the fate of individual species under different scenarios. To my mind, there's no reason why this form of modelling cannot be built into an Eloha study so that we have models for rivers with different hydrological characteristics likely to experience different changes in flow regime. At the beginning of my lecture today, I promised to walk us through the central pathway of this marvellous summary from Leroy Koff and John Matthews. And you will see that we've got to the middle of the pathway, which now mentions the Brisbane Declaration. So I'm moving now into a rather different arena of my work to publicise the importance of environmental flows. The Brisbane Declaration and Global Action Agenda 2007 was a product of the 10th Annual International River Symposium and Environmental Flows Conference held in Brisbane in September of that year. Approximately 750 delegates from over 50 countries attended this symposium, and from it, a group of us developed a statement, a declaration, a new definition of environmental flows, and a call for action. Here's our new definition. Environmental flows describe the quantity, timing, and quality of water flows required to sustain freshwater and estuarine ecosystems and the human livelihoods and well-being that depend on these ecosystems. The declaration includes 7 environmental flow principles and a 9-point global action agenda designed to protect rivers by maintaining or protecting or restoring environmental flows. The action agenda includes advice, recommendations to estimate and implement environmental flows globally, to integrate water quality into flow management, to integrate environmental flows into land and water management, to identify a network of free-flowing rivers, establish institutional frameworks, actively engage all stakeholders, and build capacity and learn by doing. This declaration was lodged on the website of the International River Foundation, located in Brisbane but with international reach, and it was also lodged on the website of the Nature Conservancy in the US. It has spread widely through the literature. It's very frequently cited. About a year ago, I did a check on how many books have cited the declaration and found that 30 books across a range of themes from engineering and eco-hydraulics to ecology have cited the definition. What I didn't find was very much further use or comment within those books about the declaration. However, it is considered to have had a major influence. Hence, 10 years later, at the 20th Annual International River Symposium, also held in Brisbane, it was decided by the management team of that conference to revisit the 2007 Declaration and renew it. And this we did through a number of processes and a number of engagements with as many people as we could reach through social media and other methods. Of great importance was that we redefined environmental flows as follows. Environmental flows describe the quantity, timing, and quality of freshwater flows and levels necessary to sustain aquatic ecosystems, which in turn support human cultures, economies, sustainable livelihoods, and well-being. The group of us writing this paper wanted to extend the concept of environmental flows beyond rivers. We wanted global recognition that all freshwater ecosystems require a flow regime, a standing water regime, an underground water regime. And so we listed the aquatic ecosystems that we consider should be embraced into this declaration and definition of environmental flows. We also debated whether the term environmental flows was really appropriate, and some people felt it should be different. For instance, in some parts of the world, environmental flows are called ecological flows. However, our deliberations reached the conclusion that to change this term, which has such global reach and familiarity, would be a mistake, that it may detach us from all of the historic work that preceded this particular event of the new declaration. And so we left the term environmental flows, but we modified the definition by saying that environmental flows involve freshwater flows and levels, levels being relevant to standing water bodies and to flowing water bodies during periods of very low flows, for example. The other change we made was a different emphasis on the importance of aquatic ecosystems for human cultures. In the 2007 definition, we were thinking of people who were very closely associated with rivers in their lifestyles, For instance, the people of the Lesotho Highlands who depend very largely on fish, and the millions of people in the Mekong River Basin who depend on fishing for food and sustenance. Here we're changing to a much broader image and representation of the necessity for environmental flows to underpin all cultures, all economies, sustainable livelihoods, and all elements of well-being for all cultures. I think that's a very big change, and it's echoed in the way we formulated the declaration. It includes 35 action recommendations, which are categorised as leadership and governance, management and implication, and research. The 2018 Brisbane Declaration and Global Action Agenda on Environmental Flows was published on the 2nd of July 2018. As leader of the paper, I had hoped that we would publish in 2017, exactly 10 years after the previous declaration, but it took a year to put this paper together through numerous exchanges and consultations and drafts of the paper. It was eventually accepted by Frontiers in Environmental Science and now resides in perpetuity on their website. Frontiers is very, very clever in documenting how people are reacting to a publication. You can go into the website and look up at the altimetrics about your paper. And when I did this, I found this wonderful global map of all the places where somebody has downloaded or viewed this publication. And as I watch over time, I see more and more locations and more individual downloads across the world. I look at this map and I think the lights have gone on around the world about the importance of water for the environment. And I rejoice in seeing this map. Looking at the figures, I've also followed them over the months. And as of the time of giving this lecture to you, I could see that 9,881 views or downloads have been recorded by Frontiers. I also found that Frontiers records 48 citations, and another database I checked records 70 citations. Possibly a wider range of journals was searched, or what we call grey literature may have used the declaration. Whatever, it's a very attractive and very encouraging response to a paper that we always wanted to have a global reach. I encourage you to have a look at this online and watch the further distribution around the world, and even to help promote it through your own activities. In my abstract for this lecture, I promised information on the uptake of the Declaration and Action Agenda. So in the next couple of slides, I'll walk you through some of the responses to parts of our declaration. On this slide, I'm citing one of the statements of the declaration, that local knowledge and customary water management practices can strengthen environmental flow planning, implementation, and sustainable outcomes. And here we are particularly concerned about the inclusion of local knowledge from customary users of water, from communities that may not previously have been consulted about the way rivers should be used, from Indigenous peoples, from Australian Aboriginal peoples. Our scope was broadened in this definition to embrace their knowledge and their engagement. So under leadership and governments, we recommend development and implementation of arrangements that ensure full and equal participation and respects for the rights, responsibilities and systems of governance of all cultures and stakeholders in environmental flow planning, assessment, implementation, monitoring and adaptive management. And under management, we encourage further empowering such peoples, and in research, we recommend co-development of best practice models to ensure full and equal participation and respect, etc., etc. And this is beginning to happen around the world. In 2016, I was able to join a number of colleagues who were interested in the relationship between rivers and their social relations, which is seen as a critical step to advance environmental water management. The paper we wrote together documents environmental flow case studies that recognise and meet diverse flow perceptions and the needs of human populations. In this slide, I'm showing you the fact of the remarkable new legislation developed by the New Zealand government to recognise the Whanganui River as a legal person, holding rights and responsibilities equivalent to a person. The iwi of the river hold a common understanding. I am the river, and the river is me. It will be very interesting to see how this particular development pans out in the future management of rivers and their social relations. Another element of the Brisbane Declaration and Global Action Agenda advised on the integration of environmental flows into programs and projects designed to support achievement of the water-related sustainable development goals. As custodian agency, the FAO is required to collect global data on the water stress indicator every year or at least 3 years from countries around the world. Working with authors of the Brisbane Declaration, I've been involved in webinars with FAO and numerous colleagues around the world. And our advice in those webinars has been to adopt the Brisbane Declaration and its definition of environmental flows. This has been done, but water quality has not been included, because it is dealt with in a different sustainable development goal. We've recommended reporting by region on major river basins rather than for the country as a whole, and that is in progress in some countries. And we've also recommended reporting on a range of indicators. This is under consideration. And finally, we would like to see a global review of country environmental flows progress, and this is under consideration. To wrap up this lecture, I want to make a few comments on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and how environmental flows are being put forward as an important aspect of achieving the new vision. The Global Biodiversity Framework mission is to halt the loss of species, ecosystems, and genetic diversity by 2030, to restore and recover biodiversity, to ensure a world of people living in harmony with nature by 2050. And those of us interested in these matters see this as a unique opportunity to restore and conserve freshwater biodiversity and give it a higher profile in the discussions and activities of the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the UN Framework Convention on Global Climate Change. To this end, a group of 25 river scientists from 14 organisations have written and published a paper entitled Bending the Curve of Global Freshwater Biodiversity Loss, an Emergency Recovery Plan. This figure illustrates our concept of the recovery plan and the actions that are needed to achieve it. We set up 6 priorities for global action to bend the curve of freshwater biodiversity loss that should be reflected in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And there they are listed in the diagram, starting with the acceleration of implementation of environmental flows and working through observations on common stresses on freshwater systems, such as water quality changes, loss of critical habitats, and the need to manage exploitation of species and riverine aggregates, the need to control invasive species, and to safeguard freshwater connectivity. In this rather complicated slide, we're showing the relationship between the CBD and SDG targets and their alignment with our statements and recommendations in the Emergency Recovery Plan for Freshwater Biodiversity. I'm going to skip through all those invisible details and come down to Action 1, which is to accelerate the implementation of environmental flows. And to start, naturally, we're recommending that the definition of environmental flows from the Brisbane Declaration and our recommendations should be noted and incorporated. We're recommending definition of a new CB target. Currently, there's no recognition of alterations in water flows and levels within the CBHE targets. And we're recommending that the process maintain the existing Sustainable Development Goal 6.4, sustainable water withdrawals, but refine indicators of environmental flow implementation, which, as I described, is in progress through FAO. In support of these activities at the highest levels of policy and engagement, the authors of the Emergency Recovery Plan have recently published a blog entitled Bring Living Waters Back to Our Planet. Again, it's multi-authored. Some of the same people and names that you have met before during this presentation. It came out on the 9th of September in 2020, published by Oxford University Press in their blog category, Academic Insights for the Thinking World. And our objective here is to bring to attention through yet another avenue or series of avenues, largely in the form of social media, to bring attention to the need for environmental flows in global rivers. We want the global audience to recognise and continue to recognise the importance of environmental flows. But we must always keep in mind that most of our rivers experience multiple stresses, hence our cartoon drawn by Seppo Leonin. We must always remember that there are multiple stresses on rivers and that environmental flows are a part of maintaining sustainability and resilience of river ecosystems. In closing, I encourage you to find this blog and send it widely through your own networks and make use of it as suits your activities and your own goals. When this blog first came out, Stuart Bunn put it on LinkedIn, and within a very short time it had 900 hits. It's certainly getting around the world, and I hope it reaches you and that you can make use of it in your own activities to protect freshwater ecosystems and biodiversity. I'm going to end there because my clock says I've been speaking for an hour, which I was informed was appropriate for this lecture. And once again, I'd like to thank the Canadian Rivers Institute for the great honour they've given to me in inviting me to give this lecture and the public lecture which follows. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I only regret that I'm not meeting you face to face. Thank you very much for listening and have a good day.
Thank you, Dr. Arthington. I'm going to now unmute Dr. Arthington, and I welcome any and all questions. So you can raise your virtual hand or you can type your question. So I see first, I saw Andre Saint-Hilaire. Maybe he was practicing raising his virtual hand. I'm going to unmute Harry Hansen. Please, I just unmuted you, but it's not showing up as green. So, there we go.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, go ahead.
All right, thanks, Dr. Arthington, for the great talk. I guess I had one question, which is in regards to environmental flows in altered systems, should we be concerned about adaptation or flow-induced evolution of fishes across time, given how long dams and alterations kind of persist for decades and centuries?
I think it's a very good question, and I appreciate that one would expect opportunities for adaptation. I'm trying to think of an example where I know that somebody has examined genetic differentiation of a population. Perhaps you know of one. But I expect there would be, over time, those sorts of adaptations, selection, in other words.
Yeah, I guess I don't have any specific example in mind. I just know from my background in fisheries-induced evolution has kind of adjusted people's understanding of life history, capacity, and biomass. And I worry about that same kind of problem taking place for fish that are dependent on very specific migratory cues or will need very specific flow conditions to successfully compete against native species or other invasives. But thank you.
Dr. Arthington, can you try and add your webcam on so people can see you?
Were you going to do that? For some reason, on my screen, I've got a photograph of a Hell's Angel. It's popped up in a little box, hiding all the... Share my webcam, is that what we need?
Yeah.
There we are. Hello, everyone. Thank you for listening.
I'll check. I've got a couple written questions here, so let me just read those out. Just a sec. Alan Curry asks, on the global uptake, where in the world, in terms of location, do we need to be quickly putting e-flows into practice?
Hello, Ellen. Thank you very much for the image and the paper you sent me. Much has been written about critical areas in the world. The paper by Weinmiller springs to mind, the one that looked at the number of dams constructed, planned, or likely to be completed in Mekong, Congo, two other major river basins. I mean, these look like places that have really are on the urgency list to try and prevent new dams being built or to deal with those that have changed flow regimes in the past.
Thank you. Next up, we've got Dr. Tommy Linensari. He says, are there ecosystem components or biota that you feel are still consistently and systematically overlooked in the business of environmental flow?
In my experience, environmental flows has placed great emphasis on fish originally. Invertebrates started to creep in some of those early applications of PHABSIM. But when I looked across the literature on who was responding to aloha, I found significant attention to riparian vegetation, very little attention to aquatic vegetation. And I think that micro invertebrates are seriously neglected, and possibly also algae.
Thank you. Dr. Andre Saint-Hilaire says, Dr. Arthington showed how holistic approaches are gaining in popularity, but do we know how the implementations of Aloha et al. Compare with similar approaches?
I haven't done a comparison of similar approaches because I think the main advance of Aloha is to work across larger scales, multiple basins, in one's effort to find examples of gradients of flow regime change within a particular class of rivers. I haven't seen any other framework attempting that. Perhaps you're aware of one?
Oh, sorry, I'm not sure if I read it wrong. Andre clarified it's simpler instead of similar, simpler approaches.
Simpler.
Simpler, yeah.
Are there simpler ones? Or are they as effective? Sorry, was that the question?
Yes, I believe so. How does Aloha relate and compare to simpler approaches?
Well, some people have said that holistic approaches as a whole are becoming more and more complex and indeed challenging to apply. And I guess that's a fair comment when you've been looking at simpler methods that are largely hydrological or hydraulic. But another framework that I think has been very influential in trying to bring together all the ecological components that I outlined and the socio-ecological is drift, the methodology developed in the Lesotho Highlands by Dr. Jackie King and colleagues. And that's been widely used in applications where the amount of information may actually be quite small, but there's a lot of cultural input, local input, rating analyses that involve ratings and expert opinion. So I think I'm saying that these methods that seem complicated, once they are framed and exposed and applied, have wide application and appeal.
Thank you. Dr. Karen Kidd says, thank you very much for the great presentation, Dr. Arthington. It is impressive how much global impact your work has had. What is your advice to the younger researchers about getting their science to decision makers?
Well, the first piece of advice is to start early and to find your own best method for communicating beyond your scientific group. I think it's very important to have your own group of scientists and to keep enlarging it and to draw on their resources and use them to help you spread the word about your work. But nowadays, compared to what was available to me, you have so many different kinds of outlets available, and you're all, younger than me, very adept at using multimedia. So there's just a proliferation of opportunities for you to spread the word. It doesn't all have to be scientific work. I've found that writing scientific papers, engaging with agencies and writing reports to assist their work, speaking often, going to different meetings, writing a couple of blogs, writing articles in our centre's newsletter. All of these ways of communicating have helped me to spread the word in Australia and beyond.
Thanks, that's great advice. I don't see any more questions right now, so I'll just wait a minute or two and see if there's more. Anybody wants to raise their hand or type another question into the question box.
I am very willing to answer any written questions because, quite frankly, I'm pretty exhausted because it's after midnight. Well,
Yes.
after midnight, but I'm hanging in there.
You are
But I
doing
can answer written questions if you want to send them to me.
Yeah, we can welcome any to the cri@unb.ca email, and then we can forward them on to Dr. Arthington and reply with, and even do some posts. So later in a few hours, we're going to be releasing the public lecture, and the same deal will happen there. If people have questions, they can send them in, and we will send them to Dr. Arthington and get replies. So I want to, on behalf of all of the Canadian Rivers Institute, I want to thank you tremendously. You're an absolute trooper to be doing this at midnight your time and accommodating us over on this side of the world. So thank you so much for joining us live from Australia under these strange and uncertain times. So we appreciate that you were able to do this even though you weren't able to travel here face to face. Thank you so much, everybody, and thank you for attending. And like I said, keep ears and eyes out for the announcements on the scholarships this afternoon, and also the public lecture will be released as on YouTube and Facebook. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.